The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Owyhee, Nevada territory, as Julia Hayes clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, hiding the small but noticeable swell of her belly beneath the worn fabric. The year was 1868, and for an unmarried woman in her condition, the West offered little mercy and even less forgiveness. Julia had arrived in town just yesterday, having traveled for weeks by stagecoach from St. Louis after her fiancé's death. Thomas had been killed in a factory accident before they could marry, before he even knew she was carrying his child. With her parents long dead and her reputation in tatters back east, Julia had sold nearly everything she owned to make the journey west, clutching a letter from her late aunt, who had once mentioned a boarding house in Owyhee that might take her in. But the boarding house was gone now, burned down last winter according to the station master, and Julia found herself with nowhere to go and precious little money to her name. As she walked down the street, searching for any establishment that might hire a woman in her condition, she felt the stares of townspeople boring into her back. The whispers followed her like shadows. "Fallen woman," they said, "no better than she ought to be." Julia lifted her chin, refusing to let them see her despair. She was 22 years old, educated enough to teach if someone would have her, and determined that her child would have a chance at life, no matter what sacrifices she had to make. The Silver Dollar Saloon loomed ahead, its weathered signs swinging slightly in the morning breeze. Julia hesitated, knowing that a saloon was no place for a respectable woman, but desperation had a way of changing one's notions of respectability. Perhaps they needed someone to clean or cook. As she approached the batwing doors, they swung outward suddenly, and Julia found herself colliding with a solid wall of a man. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, steadying her before she could fall back into the dirt. "Whoa there, madam, you all right?" His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that marked him as not being from these parts originally. Julia looked up into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a worn Stetson hat. The man standing before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with a day's growth of beard shadowing his jaw. A silver star pinned to his vest caught the sunlight. "I'm fine, thank you," Julia said, taking a step back and adjusting her shawl. "I was just looking for work." The man, the sheriff, she realized, frowned slightly. "The Silver Dollar ain't hiring ladies for respectable work, madam." "I need employment, sir," Julia replied, lifting her chin, "and I'm willing to do honest labor, whatever it may be." His eyes traveled over her form, and for a moment, Julia feared he'd noticed her condition. But his expression remained neutral as he tipped his hat. "Name's Sheriff Brock Bennett," he said. "And you'd be Julia Hayes," she replied, offering a small curtsy out of habit. "Recently arrived from St. Louis?" "Well, Miss Hayes," he said, "if it's work you're after, Mrs. Daniels at the hotel might need help with laundry and cleaning. Tell her I sent you." Relief washed over Julia. "Thank you, Sheriff, I'll do that right away." As she turned to go, the sheriff called after her. "Miss Hayes, this town can be rough on newcomers. You need anything, my office is just down the street." Julia nodded gratefully and hurried toward the Owyhee Hotel, feeling the sheriff's gaze on her back as she went. She didn't notice the three rough-looking men watching her from across the street, their eyes following her with predatory interest. Mrs. Daniels, a stern-faced woman with gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, looked Julia up and down suspiciously when she arrived at the hotel seeking employment. "Sheriff Bennett sent you, did he?" she asked, her lips pursed. "Yes, madam," Julia replied, standing as straight as possible, keeping her shawl wrapped around her middle. "I'm in need of honest work." Mrs. Daniels's eyes narrowed. "We don't employ women of loose morals here, Miss Hayes." Julia felt her cheeks flame. "I assure you, Mrs. Daniels, I am not. I've been running this hotel for 15 years, the older woman interrupted. "I know a woman in trouble when I see one." Her gaze dropped pointedly to Julia's midsection. Julia's heart sank. If Mrs. Daniels had noticed so quickly, how long before the entire town knew? To her surprise, Mrs. Daniels sighed and her expression softened slightly. "The sheriff's a good man. If he sent you, I suppose I can give you a chance. Room and board plus $2 a week." Work starts at dawn, ends when the work is done, 1 day off a month. Thank you, Julia whispered, blinking back tears of relief. I won't disappoint you. See that you don't, Mrs. Daniels replied. Your condition, how far along? 4 months, Julia admitted. Well, you can work until you show too much to be decent after that. She shrugged. We'll see. Julia settled into a routine quickly. Rising before dawn, she helped in the hotel kitchen, prepared breakfast for the guests, and spent her days laundering sheets, scrubbing floors, and attending to the endless chores of a busy hotel. The work was exhausting, but she was grateful for it, for the small room in the attic she could call her own, and for Mrs. Daniels's grudging protection. She saw Sheriff Bennett occasionally, tipping his hat to her when they passed on the street or when he stopped by the hotel for his midday meal. Sometimes she felt his eyes on her, watching, assessing, but he never said more than a polite greeting. The weeks passed, and despite her efforts to conceal her condition, Julia's belly grew more pronounced. The whispers in town increased, and she felt the weight of disapproving stares wherever she went. Mrs. Daniels had been surprisingly understanding so far, but Julia knew her time at the hotel was growing short. One evening, as Julia was returning to the hotel after delivering clean linens to the doctor's office, she found herself surrounded by 3 men who stepped out of the alley beside the general store. She recognized them as regular patrons of the Silver Dollar rough men who worked the nearby silver mines and spent their wages on whiskey and cards. Well, drawled the tallest of the 3, a man with a pockmarked face and yellow teeth. If it ain't the fancy Eastern lady with the growing belly. Julia clutched her basket tighter and tried to step around them. Excuse me, gentlemen, I need to return to the hotel. The second man, short but broad-shouldered, blocked her path. Not so fast, we've been wondering about you. Woman in your condition, all alone, must be lonely nights. Fear clawed at Julia's throat as the men closed in around her. The street was empty in the gathering dusk, and she knew she couldn't outrun them. Please, she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to appear calm. Let me pass. We just want to be friendly, said the third man, reaching for her arm, the sharp click of a pistol being cocked cut through the air. I suggest you boys find somewhere else to be. Now. Sheriff Bennett stood a few paces away, his revolver aimed steadily at the group. His face was set in hard lines, eyes cold as winter ice. The men backed away, muttering curses. We was just talking, Sheriff, said the pockmarked man. Talk somewhere else, Bennett replied, his voice level but threatening. And if I see any of you within 10 feet of Miss Hayes again, you'll be having your next conversation from inside my jail. The men slunk away into the gathering darkness, and Julia released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, she said, her voice unsteady. Sheriff Bennett holstered his weapon and approached her, concern evident in his eyes. Are you hurt? No, Julia assured him. Just frightened. He nodded, his gaze moving to her midsection, which her thin shawl no longer concealed effectively. Miss Hayes, I think it's time we had a conversation about your situation. Julia felt a chill run through her. Would he ask her to leave town now? Many communities in the West didn't tolerate unmarried mothers, considering them a moral corruption. Of course, Sheriff, she replied, lifting her chin. Though I assure you I'm causing no trouble. I never said you were, he replied, his expression unreadable in the fading light. May I walk you back to the hotel? We can talk on the way. They walked in silence for a moment, Julia acutely aware of the tall man beside her and of the curious glances from the few people still on the street. How much longer will Mrs. Daniels let you stay? He asked finally. Julia swallowed. Another 2 weeks, perhaps. She's been kinder than I expected, but she says it won't look right, having me there once I can't hide. This. She gestured vaguely toward her belly. Bennett nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. And after that, what are your plans? I don't know, Julia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I have a little money saved. Perhaps I can find a place outside of town, somewhere quiet until after. And then what? A woman alone with a baby has few options in these parts. Julia stopped walking, turning to face him directly. Sheriff Bennett, I appreciate your concern, but I don't expect anyone to solve my problems. I made choices that led me here, and I'll find a way forward. "The baby's father?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Dead," Julia replied flatly. Before we could marry, before he even knew about the child, Bennett's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Hayes." They had reached the hotel, and Julia turned to bid him good night, but he spoke before she could. "Miss Hayes, Julia, I have a proposition for you. One that might solve your immediate difficulties." Julia felt her pulse quicken. What sort of proposition would a man make to a woman in her condition? "I own a small ranch about 5 miles outside town," he continued. "Nothing fancy, but the house is sound. I need someone to keep it while I'm in town on sheriff business, which is most days and some nights." "You're offering me employment as your housekeeper?" Julia asked, confusion evident in her voice. "I'm offering you marriage," he said simply. Julia stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Marriage, but we barely know each other." "It would be a marriage of convenience," he explained, his voice low so as not to be overheard by passers-by. "You need a name for your child, a roof over your head, and protection. I need someone to tend my home and could use a wife for appearance's sake. The territory governor is pressing for more settled families in these parts, and a bachelor sheriff doesn't inspire the right confidence." Julia felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. "You would do this for a stranger, take on another man's child." Bennett's blue eyes held her steadily. "This baby will have my name. No one need ever know differently. Children shouldn't be punished for the circumstances of their birth." "And what would you expect of me?" Julia asked cautiously, the implication clear. "Cooking, cleaning, maintaining the house. A respectable appearance in town when needed," he replied matter-of-factly. "Nothing more than you're comfortable with, Miss Hayes. I'm not looking to take advantage." Julia's mind raced. Marriage to this virtual stranger seemed madness, and yet, what choice did she truly have? A woman alone with an illegitimate child faced a future of constant struggle at best, ostracism and destitution at worst. "May I have time to consider your offer?" she asked finally. Bennett nodded. "Of course, I'll call on you tomorrow evening." "But Julia," he hesitated, then continued, "those men tonight won't be the last to cause trouble. Your situation becomes more obvious by the day, and there are those in town who won't be as understanding as Mrs. Daniels." With that warning, he tipped his hat and turned to go, leaving Julia standing at the hotel entrance, her thoughts in turmoil. That night, Julia barely slept, her mind turning over the sheriff's unexpected proposal. She knew nothing about him beyond his position and reputation in town. Was he kind? Cruel? Would he eventually resent her and the child? But as dawn approached, she realized that, extraordinary as it seemed, Sheriff Bennett's offer represented her best chance, perhaps her only chance for security and respectability. The next day dragged endlessly as Julia went about her duties at the hotel, her mind preoccupied with the decision before her. Mrs. Daniels noticed her distraction. "You're a million miles away today, girl," the older woman remarked as they folded sheets together. "Something troubling you more than usual?" Julia hesitated, then decided to confide in the only person who had shown her any real kindness since her arrival. "Sheriff Bennett has asked me to marry him." Mrs. Daniels's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Has he now? Well, that explains a few things." "What do you mean?" "The way he watches you when he comes in for his meals. I thought he was just being cautious at first, keeping an eye on the new girl in town. But there was more to it than that, seems like." Mrs. Daniels studied Julia's face. "And what did you tell him?" "That I needed time to consider," Julia replied, smoothing a wrinkle from the sheet in her hands. "Consider what? Whether to accept the best offer you're likely to get in your condition." Mrs. Daniels's tone was blunt but not unkind. "Brock Bennett is respected in these parts, honest, fair-minded. Keeps to himself mostly, but does his job well." "But I hardly know him," Julia protested. "Many a marriage starts that way out here," Mrs. Daniels pointed out. "At least he's offering you a choice, which is more than most women in your situation get." That evening, Sheriff Bennett arrived at the hotel promptly at 7, dressed in a clean shirt and his best coat, his hat in his hands. Julia had taken extra care with her appearance as well, wearing her one good dress, though it was becoming tight around the middle, Mrs. Daniels allowed them use of the small parlor off the hotel lobby for privacy, though she gave Bennett a stern look that clearly communicated a warning to behave himself. "Have you considered my proposal, Miss Hayes?" Bennett asked once they were seated. Julia took a deep breath. "I have. And I have some questions, if you don't mind. Ask anything you like." "Why me? Surely there are other women in the territory who would make a more suitable wife for the sheriff, women without complications." Bennett's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm 32 years old, Miss Hayes. Been sheriff here for 5 years, and before that, I rode with the Texas Rangers. I've never had time for courting, and most women looking to marry want a man who will be home every night, not one who might get shot enforcing the law." "That doesn't explain why you'd take on a woman carrying another man's child," Julia pressed. Bennett was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on some middle distance. "My mother found herself in a similar situation once," he said finally. "A man took advantage of her when I was about 10 years old. She discovered she was with child and with no family but me to help her. Things looked grim." Julia's heart tightened at the pain evident in his voice. "A widower who owned the general store where she worked offered to marry her. Said he'd raise the baby as his own. They had a good marriage until they both passed from fever 5 years later." He met Julia's gaze directly. "I believe in paying forward kindness when I can, Miss Hayes, and I think we could help each other." Julia studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motives, but found only sincerity in his blue eyes. "If I accept," she said slowly, "I would want us to be clear about expectations. This would be a marriage in name only?" "For as long as you wish it to be," he replied evenly. "I won't deny I find you attractive, Miss Hayes, but I've never forced my attentions on any woman, and I don't intend to start with my wife." Julia felt a blush warm her cheeks at his frank admission. "And the child, you would truly claim it as your own?" "This baby will have my name," he repeated firmly. "No one would dare suggest otherwise." The conviction in his voice gave Julia a sense of security she hadn't felt since Thomas's death. She took a deep breath, making her decision. "Then, Sheriff Bennett, I accept your proposal." For the first time since they'd met, a genuine smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him appear years younger. "Brock," he corrected gently. "If we're to be married, you should call me Brock." "Brock," Julia repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "And I'm Julia." "Julia Bennett," he said, as if trying out the sound of it. "Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Despite her nervousness, Julia found herself smiling back at him. "Yes, I believe it does." They were married 3 days later by the circuit judge who happened to be passing through Owyhee. The ceremony was brief and held in Sheriff Bennett's office, with Mrs. Daniels and Doc Wilson as witnesses. Julia wore her best dress with a small bouquet of wildflowers Brock had brought her that morning, and he wore a clean black suit that made his shoulders look even broader than usual. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Brock hesitated only a moment before leaning down to place a gentle, chaste kiss on Julia's lips, their first physical contact beyond a handshake. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft, and Julia felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at the brief contact. Mrs. Daniels hosted a small reception at the hotel, where the few respectable townsfolk who had been invited offered cautious congratulations. Julia noted the speculative glances at her midsection and the raised eyebrows at the hasty nature of the wedding, but with Brock's solid presence beside her, she found she cared less about their judgment than she had before. That evening, Brock drove Julia to his ranch in a sturdy wagon loaded with her few possessions and wedding gifts from well-wishers, primarily practical items like linens, cookware, and preserves. The ranch came into view just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It was modest but well-maintained. A solid log house with a covered porch, a barn, a corral with several horses, and a small kitchen garden. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with the last of winter's snow. "It's not much," Brock said as he helped Julia down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "But it's peaceful here." "It's lovely," Julia replied honestly, taking in the quiet beauty of the place that was now her home. Inside, the house was simply furnished but clean and orderly. A main room served as both parlor and dining area with a stone fireplace at one end. A kitchen extended off the back, and two doors led to what Julia assumed were bedrooms. "That's my room, our room," Brock said, nodding toward the larger door, then hesitated. "Though I've made up the spare room for myself until you're comfortable with other arrangements." Julia felt a rush of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, this is all happening rather quickly." "It is," he agreed. "We have time to get to know each other better." That night, after Brock had shown her around the property and helped bring in her belongings, they shared their first meal as husband and wife. Julia had insisted on cooking, despite Brock's protests that she must be tired from the day's events. "I should start as I mean to go on," she had said firmly. "Besides, cooking helps me think." Over a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and cornbread, they began the strange process of getting acquainted with the person they were now bound to for life. "How did you come to be sheriff?" Julia asked as they ate. Brock took a sip of coffee before answering. "After the Rangers, I drifted for a while, ended up here about 5 years back just as the previous sheriff was retiring. Town council was desperate for someone with experience handling trouble, and I was tired of wandering." "Do you enjoy the work?" He considered this. "Enjoy might not be the right word. I'm good at it. It needs doing." He paused. "What about you? What brought you all the way from St. Louis to Owyhee?" Julia told him about Thomas, the factory accident, and her discovery that she was with child after his death. "My parents died years ago, and I had no family left in St. Louis. My aunt had mentioned Owyhee in her letters before she passed. It seemed as good a destination as any, far enough that no one would know my past." "And now," Brock asked quietly, "any regrets about accepting my offer?" Julia looked across the table at this man, her husband, studying his face in the lamplight. There was a quiet strength to him, a steadiness that she found reassuring. "No," she said truthfully, "no regrets." Later, as Julia lay in the large bed that now belonged to her alone, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night and the occasional creak of floorboards as Brock moved about in the small second bedroom, she placed a hand on her swelling belly and whispered, "We might be all right after all, little one." The following weeks brought a period of adjustment as Julia and Brock settled into their new roles as husband and wife. Julia took to ranch life with determination, learning to manage the household, tend the garden, and even help with some of the livestock when Brock was away in town. Brock typically left for town early in the morning and returned by supper, though occasionally his duties required him to stay overnight in his small room behind the jail. On those evenings, Julia found herself missing his presence in the house, a realization that surprised her. They developed a comfortable routine, sharing meals when he was home and gradually learning more about each other. Brock proved to be a man of few words but thoughtful actions. He began bringing Julia small gifts from town, a length of pretty fabric, a book of poetry, fresh fruit that had arrived on the stage from California. "You don't need to court me, you know," Julia teased one evening when he presented her with a jar of lemon drops. "We're already married." A hint of color touched Brock's cheeks. "Maybe I'm making up for not courting you properly beforehand." As her pregnancy progressed, Brock became increasingly protective, insisting on handling the more strenuous chores himself and hiring the blacksmith's teenage son to help around the ranch when he was in town. "I'm with child, not made of porcelain," Julia protested when Brock refused to let her help unload supplies from the wagon. "Humor me," he replied, his expression serious. "I've seen women work themselves too hard during pregnancy and lose the baby for it. I won't risk that happening to you." His concern touched her, especially knowing the child wasn't his by blood. Yet increasingly, Brock spoke of the baby as ours, planning for its arrival with a quiet excitement that Julia found endearing. One evening in her 6th month, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Brock asked, "Have you thought about names?" Julia, who had been thinking of little else lately, nodded. "If it's a girl, I thought perhaps Elizabeth, after my mother." "Elizabeth Bennett," Brock said, testing the sound. "It's a fine name, and if it's a boy." Julia hesitated. "I had thought perhaps Thomas after his father, but..." Brock was silent for a moment. Would you consider naming him after my father, William, though we called him Will? Julia looked at him, surprised by the request. William Bennett. It does have a nice sound to it. We could still use Thomas as a middle name, Brock offered. William Thomas Bennett, the gesture acknowledging the baby's biological father while still claiming the child as his own, brought unexpected tears to Julia's eyes. That's very generous of you. Brock shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with her emotion. It's only right. A boy should know where he comes from, even if that knowledge is just in his name. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Julia found herself wishing Brock would join her in the main bedroom rather than retiring to his separate room. The thought startled her when had her feelings for her husband of convenience shifted to something more. Their first real test as a couple came in Julia's 7th month, when a group of 5 outlaws rode into Owyhee, intent on robbing the bank. Brock had been ambushed while making his rounds and shot in the shoulder before he managed to wound 2 of the gang members and drive the others away. Julia was at the general store when she heard the shots and ran toward the commotion, heedless of her condition. She found Brock slumped against the wall of the bank, blood staining his shirt, his face pale but determined as he kept his gun trained on one of the wounded outlaws. "Brock!" She cried, rushing to his side. "Stay back, Julia," he warned, his voice strained. "Get Doc Wilson." But Julia was already examining his wound, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the bleeding. "The doctor's coming. Hold still." In the aftermath, as Brock lay recovering in their home, his shoulder bandaged and his face still drawn with pain despite the laudanum Doc Wilson had given him, Julia realized fully how much this man had come to mean to her. She sat by his bedside through the night, wiping his brow when fever set in, forcing him to drink water, and praying as she had not prayed since her parents' deaths years before. Near dawn, as Brock's fever finally broke, he caught her hand in his. "You should rest," he murmured, his blue eyes clouded with pain but lucid. "Think of the baby." "The baby and I are fine," Julia assured him, squeezing his hand. "It's you I'm worried about." Brock managed a weak smile. "Takes more than a bullet to keep me down." "It had better," she replied fiercely. "Because I'm not ready to be a widow again." Brock Bennett, his eyes searched her face. Again, Julia realized her slip. "I never married Thomas, but in my heart, it felt the same as losing a husband." Brock was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere, Julia. I promise." During his recovery, their relationship deepened as physical boundaries necessarily blurred. Julia helped Brock bathe, change his bandages, and dress, her initial embarrassment giving way to a comfortable intimacy. For his part, Brock maintained a respectful distance despite their increased physical closeness, never presuming or pushing for more than she offered. By the time Brock was well enough to return to light duties, Julia was in her 8th month, her belly large and the baby active. The townsfolk, who had initially viewed their hasty marriage with suspicion, now seemed to accept them as a couple, especially after Julia's devoted care of the injured sheriff became common knowledge. Mrs. Peterson at the mercantile asked when the baby is due, Julia mentioned one evening as they sat by the fire, Brock whittling a small wooden horse while Julia mended a shirt. She seemed genuinely interested, not just prying. Brock nodded, his hands steady as he carved. "People are coming around." "You've won them over." "We have," Julia corrected. "Your standing in the community has protected me from the worst of the gossip." Brock looked up from his work. "You give me too much credit. It's your grace and dignity that have changed minds." Julia felt warmth spread through her at his praise. These moments, quiet evenings by the fire, the gentle domesticity they had established had become precious to her in ways she had never anticipated when accepting his proposal of convenience. As her time grew near, Brock insisted that Doc Wilson check on Julia regularly and arranged for Mrs. Daniels to stay at the ranch when he had to be in town. "You're fussing unnecessarily," Julia told him after he'd ridden 10 miles to fetch a special herbal tea the doctor had recommended for her swollen ankles. "Let me fuss," Brock replied, his expression unusually vulnerable. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you or the baby." Julia reached for his hand, drawing him to sit beside her on the porch swing. "Brock, why did you really ask me to marry you? The truth now." He was silent for a long moment, his thumb absently stroking the back of her hand. "I told you about my mother," he said finally. "What I didn't tell you was that before the shopkeeper married her, she tried to rid herself of the baby, nearly died from it." Julia gasped softly. "I was just a boy, but I remember finding her the blood." He closed his eyes briefly. "The doctor saved her, and later the shopkeeper saved us both in a different way. When I saw you in town, alone and pregnant, something in your eyes reminded me of my mother, that same desperate determination." "You felt sorry for me," Julia said, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "No," Brock said firmly, turning to face her. "I admired your courage, and then, as I watched you working at the hotel, holding your head high despite the whispers, I found myself thinking about you more than was proper for a sheriff regarding a woman new to town." He took a deep breath. "I proposed marriage because I respected you and thought we could build something honest together. But Julia, in these months since, I've come to care for you in ways I never expected." Julia felt tears gathering in her eyes. "I've come to care for you too, Brock, very much." His expression softened, and he reached up to cup her cheek, his calloused palm gentle against her skin. "I know this isn't the love match you must have dreamed of as a girl, it's better," Julia interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "We're building something real, based on respect and genuine affection. That's worth more than fleeting passion." Brock's eyes darkened slightly at her words. "The passion isn't lacking on my part, Julia. I just didn't want to presume." The admission sent a flutter through Julia's chest. "Nor on mine," she confessed softly. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and when she didn't, he kissed her, not the brief, formal kiss of their wedding day, but a real kiss, tender yet insistent, that spoke of months of restrained longing. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Brock rested his forehead against hers. "I think I'm falling in love with my wife," Julia smiled, joy bubbling up inside her, "and I with my husband." That night, for the first time, Brock joined Julia in the main bedroom, though he insisted on simply holding her as she slept, mindful of her advanced pregnancy. "There's time enough for everything else," he whispered, his arms secure around her. "We have the rest of our lives." 2 weeks later, as a spring storm lashed at the windows of their ranch house, Julia went into labor. Brock had ridden for Doc Wilson at the first signs, but the storm was making the roads treacherous, and by the time they returned, Julia's labor was well advanced. "First babies usually take their time," the doctor said reassuringly as he examined her. "But this little one seems in a hurry to meet the world." The hours that followed were a blur of pain and determination for Julia. Brock refused to leave her side despite the doctor's suggestion that the birthing room was no place for a man. "My place is with my wife," he said firmly, holding Julia's hand as she labored. As dawn broke and the storm finally subsided, Julia gave a final, exhausted push, and the sound of a baby's indignant cry filled the room. "You have a son," Doc Wilson announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the squalling infant before placing him in Julia's arms. Julia gazed down at the tiny red face, overwhelmed by a love so fierce it took her breath away. "William," she whispered. "William Thomas Bennett." She looked up at Brock, who was staring at the baby with an expression of wonder. "Would you like to hold your son?" Brock reached for the child with trembling hands, cradling him with a tenderness that made Julia's heart swell. "Hello, William," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your pa." In that moment, watching her husband hold her child, their child now, in every way that mattered, Julia knew that the desperate journey that had brought her to Owyhee had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The months following William's birth brought new challenges and joys as Julia and Brock adjusted to parenthood. William proved to be a healthy, robust baby with a shock of dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes. Brock was an attentive father, spending every free moment with the child, often carrying him around the ranch in a sling Julia had fashioned, pointing out horses and cattle to the wide-eyed infant. "He's too young to understand," Julia laughed one evening as Brock earnestly explained the workings of a windmill to their 3-month-old son. "He's a Bennett," Brock replied with a proud smile. "Quick learner, I can tell." Their physical relationship had deepened as well, once Julia had healed from childbirth. Their first time together had been tentative, both nervous despite their married status, but they quickly discovered a passionate compatibility that added a new dimension to their already strong bond. "I never thought I could be this happy," Julia confessed one night as they lay entwined in their bed. The sound of William's soft breathing coming from the cradle nearby, Brock pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Nor I thought being sheriff was all the purpose I needed in life. Now I can't imagine going back to that solitary existence." When William was 6 months old, Julia discovered she was pregnant again, this time with Brock's child. The news filled them both with joy, though Brock became, if possible, even more protective of his wife. "You act as though I'm the first woman ever to have 2 children close together," Julia teased as he insisted on hiring a girl from town to help with the heavier housework. "You're the only woman I care about having 2 children close together," Brock replied, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "I want to take care of you both." As Julia's belly began to swell with their second child, William took his first steps, toddling precariously across the kitchen floor into his father's waiting arms. Brock swept the boy up with a whoop of delight, spinning him around as William giggled. "Did you see that, Julia?" "Strong legs, just like his pa," Julia smiled, watching the man she had married out of desperation now playing joyfully with the child he had claimed as his own. There were moments she almost forgot that William wasn't Brock's by blood. The bond between them was so natural, so complete. The town had fully embraced them as a family by now. When they attended church on Sundays, William dressed in his best clothes and perched on Brock's shoulders. Townspeople stopped to admire the child and congratulate them on the coming addition to their family, even Mrs. Daniels, who had initially been so suspicious of Julia, had become a regular visitor to the ranch and a doting honorary grandmother to William. "Never thought I'd see the day Brock Bennett would be a family man," she remarked to Julia during one visit. "That man was married to his badge before you came along. You've been good for him." "We've been good for each other," Julia replied, watching through the window as Brock pointed out a hawk circling overhead to William, the child's small face turned up in wonder. Their peaceful life faced a challenge when William was nearly a year old, and Julia was 5 months along with their second child. A man named James Harker arrived in Owyhee, claiming to be Thomas's brother, looking for the woman who had been engaged to his late sibling. Brock came home from town one evening with a troubled expression. "There's a man asking about you at the hotel," he told Julia after dinner once William was asleep. "Says he's Thomas Wilson's brother." Julia felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas only mentioned sisters. "He never spoke of a brother. This man says he's been searching for you since his brother's death, claims he wants to make sure his brother's fiancé and child are provided for." Brock's expression was carefully neutral, but Julia could see the tension in his jaw. "What does he want from us?" Julia asked, her hand protectively covering her swollen belly, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Brock. "He didn't say specifically, wants to meet with you tomorrow." Brock hesitated. "Julia, if there's something I should know." "There's nothing," Julia assured him quickly. "Thomas and I were engaged to be married when he died. His family knew of the engagement, but not of the baby. I didn't know myself until after the funeral. I left St. Louis before I started to show." Brock nodded slowly. "I believe you, but this man's appearance now, after all this time, seems suspicious," Julia finished for him. "I agree. I'll be with you when you meet him," Brock said firmly. "Whatever he wants, we'll face it together." The next day, they rode into town with William, who was fussed over by Mrs. Daniels, while Julia and Brock met with James Harker in the hotel parlor. Harker was a thin, sharp-featured man with none of the warmth Julia remembered in Thomas. His eyes narrowed as he took in Julia's pregnant state and the protective stance of the tall sheriff beside her. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice oily with false courtesy. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I've been searching for you for quite some time, Mr. Harker, Julia replied coolly. I must say Thomas never mentioned having a brother. A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Harker's face. We were estranged for many years. Family disagreements, you understand. We reconciled shortly before his death. What brings you to Owyhee, Mr. Harker? Brock asked directly, his hand resting lightly on the back of Julia's chair. Harker smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Family duty, Sheriff. When I learned my brother had been engaged and that his fiancé had disappeared after his death, I felt obligated to find her, to ensure she was well. As you can see, my wife is very well, Brock replied, emphasizing the word wife slightly. Yes, I see she's moved on quite successfully. Harker's gaze lingered on Julia's belly in a way that made her skin crawl. But what of my brother's child? I understand there was a baby. Julia felt Brock stiffen beside her. Our son, William, is at the hotel owner's apartment currently, she said carefully. He's a healthy, happy boy who wants for nothing. William, Harker raised an eyebrow. Not named for his father, then. He carries Thomas as his middle name, Julia replied. Sheriff Bennett has been his father in every way that matters since the day he was born. Harker leaned forward, his friendly facade slipping slightly. Be that as it may, the boy is a Wilson by blood, my brother's only legacy. As his closest living relative, I have an interest in the child's welfare and future. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Harker? Brock asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm prepared to offer financial compensation in exchange for certain rights regarding the boy. Visitation, perhaps eventually guardianship, absolutely not, Julia interrupted, anger flaring. William is our son. He bears my husband's name and is being raised in a loving home. Whatever claim you think you have is mistaken. Harker's expression hardened. I've consulted attorneys in St. Louis, Mrs. Bennett. A case could be made that the child belongs with his father's blood relations, especially given the irregular circumstances of your departure from St. Louis and subsequent marriage. Are you threatening my wife? Brock asked, his hand moving subtly toward his gun. Merely stating facts, Sheriff, Harker replied smoothly. I'll be in town for a week. Perhaps you'll reconsider my offer after you've had time to think about the alternatives. A legal battle would be unpleasant for all concerned, especially given certain rumors I heard in St. Louis about the nature of your engagement to my brother. With that veiled threat hanging in the air, Harker excused himself, leaving Julia and Brock in stunned silence. What rumors could he possibly have heard? Brock asked once they were alone. Julia shook her head, bewildered. None that have any basis in truth. Thomas was a gentleman. Our engagement was proper in every way. She bit her lip. But people do talk, especially when a woman leaves town suddenly. Brock took her hands in his. I don't care what anyone in St. Louis thinks or says. William is our son. No one is going to take him from us. But what if he pursues legal action? What if a judge sides with him because of blood relation? Then we'll fight, Brock said simply, together. Over the next few days, Harker made himself increasingly visible in town, asking questions about Julia's arrival in Owyhee and her hasty marriage to the sheriff. The townspeople, protective of their sheriff and his family, were largely close-mouthed. But the man's presence created a cloud of anxiety that hung over Julia whenever she ventured into town. Brock, meanwhile, had telegraphed contacts in St. Louis and was gathering information about James Harker. What he learned was troubling. There was a James Harker who knew Thomas, he told Julia 3 days after their meeting. But he wasn't Thomas's brother, he was a business rival who lost a significant contract to Thomas's company just before the accident. So he's an imposter, Julia said, relief and fresh alarm warring within her. But why go to such lengths? What does he really want? Money, most likely, Brock replied grimly. Or revenge. Thomas's death might have benefited him professionally, but perhaps that wasn't enough. The next morning, Brock received a telegram from St. Louis that confirmed their suspicions. The real James Wilson, Thomas's brother, had died of typhoid 5 years earlier. The man claiming to be him was a fraud. Armed with this information, Brock confronted Harker at the saloon where he had taken lodging. Your game is up, Harker, he said, tossing the telegram onto the table where the man sat nursing a whiskey. Or should I say James Reynolds? That is your real name, according to my sources in St. Louis. Harker's face drained of color as he scanned the telegram. This proves nothing. It proves you're a liar, Brock replied coldly, and I suspect you're something worse. Why are you really here? What do you want with my wife and son? Cornered, Harker's demeanor changed, the false courtesy dropping away to reveal a bitter, angry man. Your son, he spat. That boy is the only thing left of Thomas Wilson, the man who ruined me. His accident was supposed to be the end of it, but then I heard rumors his fiancé was carrying his child. Julia, who had insisted on accompanying Brock despite his objections, gasped from the doorway. You had something to do with Thomas's death. Harker's eyes darted between them, calculating. Accidents happen in factories all the time, especially when certain safety measures are overlooked. With a roar of rage, Brock lunged across the table, grabbing Harker by the throat and slamming him against the wall. You murdered an innocent man and then tracked down his fiancée to what? Take his child, kill them both. Brock, Julia cried, pulling at his arm. Not like this. He needs to face justice properly. Breathing heavily, Brock released Harker, who slumped against the wall, gasping. You're right, he said to Julia, then turned back to Harker. James Reynolds, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted kidnapping. You'll be returned to St. Louis to stand trial. As Brock dragged the man to the jail, Julia followed behind, one hand supporting her belly, the other clutching the telegram that had exposed the truth. The nightmare was over, but the revelation that Thomas had been murdered rather than dying in an accident opened old wounds she had thought long healed. That night, after William was asleep and Reynolds was securely locked in the town jail awaiting transport to St. Louis, Julia sat with Brock on their porch, processing the day's events. How are you feeling? Brock asked gently, his arm around her shoulders. Shaken, Julia admitted. To think that Thomas was deliberately killed, that this man has been searching for his child all this time, it's horrifying. Brock nodded, his expression grave. Reynolds will face justice in St. Louis. I've sent telegrams to the authorities there with his confession. What about William? Will he ever need to know any of this? Brock was quiet for a moment, considering. Someday, when he's older, he should know about Thomas, the good man his biological father was. As for Reynolds and his scheme, that can wait until William is much older, if ever. Julia leaned against Brock's solid strength, grateful for his steady presence. I'm so thankful for you, she whispered. For the family we've built, when I think how differently things could have gone if you hadn't offered marriage that day. It's the best decision I ever made, Brock replied, pulling her closer. Though I had no idea then how completely you and William would change my life. For the better, I hope, in every way imaginable, he pressed a kiss to her temple. I love you, Julia Bennett. You and our children are everything to me. And I love you, Julia replied, feeling the baby inside her kick as if in agreement. More than I ever thought possible when I accepted your proposal. With Reynolds in custody awaiting transport and the truth about his motives exposed, a weight lifted from the Bennett household. Spring moved into summer, and as Julia's time grew near, the ranch blossomed around them, the garden yielding vegetables in abundance, new calves in the pasture, and William growing more adventurous by the day. On a hot July afternoon, exactly 1 year and 2 months after William's birth, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth Bennett, Sarah for Brock's grandmother and Elizabeth for Julia's mother. Unlike William's hurried entry into the world, Sarah took her time, the labor lasting nearly a full day before she finally arrived, small and perfect with a tuft of blonde hair and eyes as blue as her father's. She has your eyes, Julia murmured tiredly as Brock held their daughter for the first time, wonder written across his face. And your strength, he replied, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. Look at all you've endured to bring her into this world. William, now a sturdy toddler with curly dark hair and an infectious laugh, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to peer at her and pat her head with his small hands. Gentle William, Brock would remind him, showing him how to carefully touch the baby's hand or foot. "She's your sister. You'll help Pa take care of her and your ma, won't you?" William would nod solemnly before breaking into a grin, clearly delighted with his new role as big brother. As summer faded into fall, life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. Brock had hired a deputy to handle more of the day-to-day work in town, allowing him to spend more time at the ranch with his family. The land around their home expanded as Brock purchased an adjoining property, with plans to increase their cattle herd and perhaps add a small orchard. "Building for the future," he explained to Julia as they walked the new boundaries one crisp October evening, Sarah bundled against his chest, William riding on his shoulders. "For our children and maybe their children someday." "Are you suggesting we might have more?" Julia asked teasingly. Brock grinned, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "I wouldn't be opposed to the idea, when you're ready, of course." The truth was, Julia could easily imagine more children filling their home, extending the family they had created from such unlikely beginnings. Looking at Brock with their daughter against his chest and their son perched happily on his shoulders, she felt a sense of rightness, of belonging, that had eluded her for much of her life. James Reynolds was tried and convicted in St. Louis that winter, the evidence of his tampering with factory equipment leading to Thomas's death deemed conclusive. The news brought a sense of closure to Julia, though she would always carry a small sadness for the man who had fathered her firstborn son. "I wish Thomas could have known William," she confided to Brock one night, "but I'm so grateful that William has you as his father." "I think about that sometimes," Brock admitted. "Whether I'm raising him as Thomas would have wanted, I hope I am." "You're raising him with love and integrity," Julia said firmly. "No father could do more or better than that." As William's second birthday approached, Julia noticed Brock spending time in the barn after the children were asleep, working on some secret project. When she asked, he merely smiled mysteriously and said, "You'll see soon enough." On William's birthday, after the small celebration with cake and presents from town, Brock led them all out to the barn. There, displayed proudly on a workbench, was a beautifully crafted rocking horse, painted white with a real horsehair mane and tail. "For our son," Brock said, lifting an awestruck William onto the horse's back. "Every cowboy needs his first mount." As William rocked back and forth, shrieking with delight, Julia felt tears prick her eyes at the love evident in every careful detail of Brock's gift. This man, who had married her out of compassion and duty, had become the center of their family, the foundation upon which their happiness was built. Later that night, with both children finally asleep, Julia and Brock sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking on another man's child and a pregnant wife when you could have had your pick of any unmarried woman in the territory." Brock turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Julia, from the moment I saw you walking down the street that first day, your chin lifted despite the whispers. I knew you were someone special. Marrying you wasn't a sacrifice or a duty, it was the best decision of my life." He took her hand, running his thumb across her wedding band. "William is my son in every way that matters. The fact that another man fathered him doesn't change that, and now we have Sarah too, and perhaps more children in the years to come." "Our family," Julia murmured, leaning into his embrace. "Our family," Brock agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Built on choice and love, which seems to me a stronger foundation than most." 5 years later, the Bennett Ranch had prospered into one of the most successful properties in the county. Brock had retired as sheriff to focus on ranching and raising their growing family, which now included 4-year-old James, born 2 years after Sarah. Julia had established a small school on their property, teaching not only their children but those of neighboring ranchers and their workers. William, now 7 and the spitting image of his mother with the same thoughtful nature and hazel eyes, was already showing a remarkable aptitude for working with horses. Brock had given him a gentle pony of his own, and the boy spent hours in the corral, learning to ride and care for the animal under his father's watchful eye. "He's a natural horseman," Brock remarked proudly one evening as they watched William brush down his pony. Has a way with them that can't be taught. Like his father, Julia replied, smiling as she bounced 2-year-old Alina, their newest addition, on her hip. Sarah, now 5 with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, was helping William, handing him brushes and combs with solemn importance. "Pa, look," William called, demonstrating a new knot Brock had taught him for securing the pony's lead rope. "I did it just like you showed me." "That's my boy," Brock called back, his face lit with pride. "Perfect job." Julia watched her husband and children, marveling at how fate had brought them together, a desperate pregnant woman and a solitary lawman, each with their own wounds and fears, who had found healing and joy in the family they'd created. "What are you thinking about?" Brock asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About that day you proposed," Julia replied, shifting Alina to her other hip. "How frightened I was, how uncertain of the future." Brock smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "And look at us now." "Look at us now," Julia echoed, leaning into his embrace as their children's laughter floated across the ranch yard in the golden light of the setting sun. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Brock pulled Julia close against his chest, his voice soft in her ear. "You know, I've been thinking, a dangerous pastime," she teased, turning in his arms to face him. "Perhaps," he chuckled, then grew more serious. "I was thinking about William's future, about the truth of his birth." Julia nodded, understanding his concern. They had agreed long ago that someday they would tell William about Thomas, but the right time had never seemed to present itself. "He's old enough now to start asking questions," Brock continued. "I don't want him to hear rumors from others. I think we should tell him the truth, that I chose to be his father, that I claimed him as my own because I wanted him, not because I was obligated." Julia touched his face gently, moved by his thoughtfulness. "You're right, but are you sure you're ready? It won't change how he sees you." "He's a Bennett," Brock said firmly. "Nothing will ever change that, but he deserves to know about the good man who gave him life, even if that man never had the chance to know him." The next day, while Sarah helped Mrs. Daniels, who now lived in a small cottage on their property, with the younger children, Brock and Julia took William for a ride to the stream that marked the eastern boundary of their land. There, sitting on a fallen log with the water bubbling nearby, they gently explained to their son the circumstances of his birth. William listened solemnly, his small face serious as he processed the information. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So, my first father died before I was born?" he asked finally. "Yes," Julia replied gently. "His name was Thomas Wilson. He was a good, kind man who would have loved you very much." William turned to Brock, his hazel eyes so like his mother's wide with uncertainty. "But you're my real pa, right?" Brock knelt before his son, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders. "William, I am your father in every way that matters. I've loved you from the moment I first held you, and nothing will ever change that. You are my son, and I am your pa." William considered this, then nodded decisively. "Good, because I wouldn't want any other pa but you." He threw his arms around Brock's neck, and Brock hugged him fiercely, meeting Julia's tear-filled eyes over the boy's shoulder. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Julia found Brock standing by the window, looking out at the ranch bathed in moonlight. "What are you thinking?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "About how close I came to missing all this," he replied, drawing her into his arms. "If you hadn't come to Owyhee, if I hadn't seen you that day and offered marriage. If I hadn't been brave enough to accept," Julia added. "Brave?" Brock raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you were feeling when you said yes?" "Terrified," Julia admitted with a soft laugh. "But something told me to trust you, that you were a man of your word when you said this baby would have your name." "Best decision we ever made," Brock murmured, lowering his head to kiss her. "Thank you for trusting me with your life and William's. Thank you for making that life more beautiful than I ever imagined possible," Julia replied, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the stars shone down on the Bennett ranch, on the house where 4 children slept peacefully, on the barn where horses and cattle rested, on the fields that would feed them in the coming year. And inside, in each other's arms, Julia and Brock Bennett found the peace and belonging they had both sought all their lives, created from an unexpected beginning into a love story neither could have imagined. In the years that followed, as their children grew and the ranch prospered, Julia would sometimes think back to that desperate young woman who had arrived in Owyhee with nothing but hope and the child growing within her. How could she have known then that the tall, serious sheriff who had come to her aid would become the love of her life, the father of her children, the foundation of her happiness? Life had a way of offering second chances when least expected. For Julia and Brock Bennett, what had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into a love as vast as the Nevada sky above their ranch, and as enduring as the mountains that stood sentinel in the distance, a testament to the family they had built together, one choice, one day, one child at a time.